What we wanted to do was, we're being a stakeholder on the Canadian ELD mandate, and we were on the first pass, and just most recently on the version that is being worked on right now. We thought we wanted to give you a heads up on how this was progressing, and I want to make sure I'm real clear that this is very preliminary on the Canadian mandate, but you're going to see a lot of similarities as we go through this to what we've seen before with the U.S. mandate. We're going to go over a few glossary terms like we always do because there's some things that are a little different. Look at a timeline and release staging, which still has some things to be determined. Take a look at how the U.S. and the Canadian ELD mandate compares, and there's quite a few similarities, and there are some changes. We're going to take a look at items pending final decision and some operational considerations that we may have covered before, but I think they're worth repeating because, you know, some people keep asking questions on them. So CCMTA is the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators, which really takes care of this. The ECM is the electronic control module. People throw different terms at that. ELD, electronic logging, and hours of service, and RODS. The thing that we throw out that I know this EOBR keeps coming back periodically, but that's basically what I would consider a dead term when the regulation was vacated back in 2011. A really roughed out timeline, and this can change. But what has happened already on September 2nd, technical stakeholders like ourselves submitted our comments into CCMTA, into that committee that's reviewing technical specifications and some other comments that may have been policy or enforcement. September 15th, there's comments due on ELD pre-consultations document. It's basically more of the value to a carrier and the process that they would go through and things that were more operational and carrier-oriented, whereas the September 2nd is basically technical review of the specifications. What's forecasted right now is in spring of 2017, probably there'll be a public comments for the Canadian Gazette 1 notice to go out. And that's where anybody can make comments in and submit them in, similar to what happens in the U.S. Somewhere between quarter 2 and 3 of 2017, there may be a tentative release target date for the final rule, and Gazette 2 is expected. The actual compliance date and the grandfather clause extension, quite frankly, is that it looks like carriers and CTA are proposing to try and follow the same kind of cycle that was in the U.S., where you had a 24-month implementation date with a 24-month follow-on grandfather clause. So that's what's being proposed towards the final rule. Now, we want to take a look at the similarities a little bit here, and when we look at this, really the Canadian mandate from the initial review here is adopting the majority of the U.S. mandate, which I think would make it easier on carriers in the transition mode going from border to border crossing where they have to transition to hours of service. It really doesn't change any hours of service, you know, so Canada's doing the same thing, and it still maintains driver control over the hours of service entries. And there would be a form of information electronically transferred to enforcement. I'll go into that a little bit more. It's not exactly the same, but similar technology is being employed. When you use the Canadian, some of the changes, which should be obvious, but you know, they're going to use the Canadian Geographic Names Database for each province. So there's really not a population limitation. In the States, they had the point of location where you had a distance and direction to say where you made your duty status change or an event, right, had a 5,000 population limit, but this does not. So there'll be more cities, townships, municipal townships, and things that are defined in this Canadian Geographic Name Database. So that's what would be employed there going forward. There's really no item similar at this time to ERODs for enforcement as there is in the U.S., but CTA has really asked for enforcement to support something similar and maybe not the same standard. We've gone through some technical review and some things on odometer reconciliation, so we're taking a look at that, and we've made some comments on what that would work, where you have a difference between your odometer and your ECM. Because as many people on the phone we may know on Canadian rules, you have to supply the beginning and ending odometer for each vehicle, right, that you use for that day. Sections in the U.S. version, they identify them as they're not required, but it looks like what we're going to do is to still maintain them so that there doesn't have to be a lot of changes in it. It may be more than is needed, but it's there and established already, and because there's so much more adopted in the way that the CCMTA is going forward, that seems like that's the best way to go about it, even though the position or the location or the feature might not be required, it's really there. The items that are pending final decision, again, we mentioned a little bit about, we're hoping for a 24-month, and that's what's being requested, is that still has yet to be determined. Another item that's yet to be defined, the federal mandate within the U.S., they went through a lot of extensive items for security and stuff, but the certification process still is yet to be determined how that would go forward. So what we've done already is look at technical specs. Security requirements for data transfer, that's another discussion point that's still open that we expect to see in the spring, but I'm sure there's going to be similar security type elements to make sure that the data upon transfer is safe. There's some operational considerations that we want to go through, and when we look at this, the changes in operational events, not very many, okay? What's on here on the left side, the existing items in the U.S. mandate, all of those items are still going to be adopted by the Canadian mandate. So there'll still be a request to record the log in and log out, power in, power up. There'll still be a yard move, and what a yard move is measuring movement within a yard as on duty time and not as drive time. And it's a manual event by the driver. Personal conveyance will still be there, but up in Canada we'll use the requirements for the personal conveyance of 75-kilometer limit in that 24-hour period, and making sure you capture odometers at that point in time. There'll still be intermediate positions once an hour while the vehicle's in motion. There will be diagnostic events, and there'll be malfunctions that have to be captured and pushed forward. So those things are the same, and what they called out right now in this first pass, and again, this is all preliminary, is about making sure that the supplier was capable of doing the Canadian deferral and the cycle changes and jurisdiction changes, things of that nature. It's a longer detailed list, but for the purpose of this presentation, I wanted to make sure people understood that all this was going to still be covered. And I would venture, and this is a risky statement on my part, that it appears that a good 75% or so, maybe 70% of the U.S. Final ruling is being adopted going forward within the Canadian mandate. Additional information will be there. All the additional Canadian items will be required, the plate numbers and the odometer reading for all CMV and trailers. There's going to be an additional fields being proposed for edits on the display screens, which some recommendations on how that could be done were requested. When you take a look at it, there's all these other things in the CDL, which is going to be the Canadian version of CDL number, whether there's an exempt status, data diagnostics, all those there, and there is an unassigned vehicle requirement movement, just like there is in the federal U.S. federal one. And I want to remind people that even though the reason this display is important, because if there's not coverage to send data or something is preventing sending a file, that the display is still a valid roadside audit mechanism. So you'll see this kind of thing also, And it's a little bit different because this is an eye chart, but basically you're going to see all these kinds of things within it. Log detail, everybody knows all the duty statuses. But you're going to see a lot of detail that's going to show log in and log off, and power on, power off, and malfunction entries, edits by the driver, anything of that nature that would be in the detail of the log. Personal conveyance will still be shown on the drive line, but in a different shading or dotted line. And yard moved would be shown on an on-duty line, also depicted by a different shading, just like in the federal rule set. Now, there's some operational things here, but basically on enforcement, they kept in check there that web services, email with SMTP functions, or fax could be used. And basically, it would be a PDF image of the file at this time, and this is in the early discussions. That's what would be sent via web services or email attachment. They also indicated there could be Bluetooth or local network with USB and a peer-to-peer. Right, very, very similar to the way the U.S. is. But as I said earlier, there wasn't really an ERODS type application, but CTA requested that something like that be worked on and developed. Some operational considerations. This is the same as the U.S. mandate, where it allowed drivers to edit their logs. And I know I've talked to some carriers, and there were some concerns on that, but the driver would be able to do this. They cannot reduce drive time. They can add drive time. They can put a drive segment in. They must approve all the edits from the back office. Drivers have the ability to get direct access to their logs, so they have their copies of them, so that they can keep them for whether it's for expense or just making sure they have an image of their logs for the time that they were in that vehicle. Personal conveyance is there, but again, using the Canadian requirements. Same thing on making it audible muting, and so the driver can keep the noise down when they're in a bunk and sleeper berth opportunity. And driver reviews all the unassigned vehicle moves. So this unassigned driving time, there's a lot of questions that came up on this under the U.S. version, and I think they're still going to be there with the Canadian version. And, driver forgets to log in and pulls away, and that's going to be a learning curve experience. I'm not saying it doesn't happen anyway, but mechanic gets in a vehicle and does a road test, and they don't log in. But they're trying to make sure to capture all these movements and assign them to the right entity. The relocating of a tractor to another yard could happen, taking a vehicle in for a warranty claim or maintenance at the local dealer. There can be corrections after the fact, right? The driver can be prompted to accept or decline this, and it has to happen. But if these other things happen where the driver is forgetting to log in or somebody else is moving the vehicle around, the driver is going to be the first one hit with the reconciliation process. And if the driver rejects it, and when they reject it with a comment, then that goes back to the carrier's responsibility, and they have to do the reconciliation on it. So when you look at this unassigned, ELD states each driver needs to have a specific ID. So that's really to prevent this unassignment. So there's also a thing in there called an exempt driver. And this exempt driver, could be that mechanic, it could be that definition of yard movements that weren't done by the driver. So you can look at this and you have to look at your own operations. And I did a presentation, I think, probably in April up at OTA, and there was a lot of discussion around this point. And it's really making sure you look at your own operations and see what makes sense for you, because you may use outside services for maintenance instead of your own mechanics. You may not have multiple yards, and you don't have to worry about things like that. But take a look at the operations and see where you can create these exempt drivers and make sure that those unassigned vehicles are moved, or that driver, when they get in the vehicle that morning, has all these unassigned vehicle moves to worry about and push, and takes time. So some of the things that are still in there, and everything is, we've converted everything appropriately like it should be to kilometers. But to drive from any other duty status, meaning on duty or off duty or sleep or berth, and you go right into drive, when motion is detected, the speed reaches a maximum of 8 kilometers. There's no time and there's no distance consideration. It's going to be speed oriented only. So if you've jogged a vehicle around, it doesn't take a whole lot to get to an 8 kilometers, speed. So on duty, on only auto duty, the only auto duty we have is that if you're stopped after 5 minutes in drive and no motion is detected, because we have to detect that motion stopped in a very short period of time, I think it's in that 3-second range. And what we have to do is present something to the driver after a minute and say, do you want to remain in drive or go to on duty? If the driver doesn't respond at all, they go into an on duty status. And then as soon as they hit 8 kilometers again, right, there you are, you're in drive. So a yard move, and sometimes this gets confused, that if you're in a yard move, it's a manual event. The driver puts themselves into this manual event. It has nothing to do with 8 kilometers at that point of speed. So that driver can put themselves into this manual yard event and drive around the yard, right? But it's an on-duty status, right? So that's all it's going to see. It's not going to be a drive time element. And the way it is in the States, it's supposed to be a private yard. So it's not truck stops and things of that nature. So some of the yard move things, there's really no limits around it, which is okay. And there's not defined thresholds for it, which is also okay. But there's no automatic changes around, because most yards I've been around in my career, you really don't see more than 10 or 15 miles per hour. But with the editor built in, right, and again, this is the preliminary rule in Canada. Something could change in the final rule. But what's really there is that the driver has an editor. So if the driver doesn't come out of the yard move appropriately, they can make an edit and turn part of that segment into a drive segment that should have been accounted for, and when they forgot to come out of a yard move. So there could be alternative, vendors, and maybe intent is that what we would do with product is give a warning at 20 or 25 miles an hour that you're still in the yard move, so that there's something triggers for the driver to let them know there could be an issue and some additional work with an editor.